Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the hidden facts buried inside the frontier of Red Dead Redemption 2. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. The distant howl, far north of Strawberry, beneath a stand of pine trees, there rests a pile of bones unlike any other in the game. They are too long, too heavy, arranged in a shape that should not belong to any creature walking the grizzlies. Players who stumble upon this place often assume they have found the remains of a bear, but the proportions are wrong in a way that nags at the back of the mind. The skull is too broad, the limbs are too long. Rockstar never confirmed exactly what creature died here, but based on the size and structure of the remains, many players have come to assume something resembling Bigfoot once roamed these mountains, and that something, eventually, did not survive them. Players who like to camp nearby after dark often describe the area as carrying a noticeably heavier silence than the surrounding woods, as if the grizzlies themselves would rather not be asked too many questions about what happened here. The man who tried to fly. In the very first Red Dead Redemption, players could meet a hopeful inventor who believed he had built a flying machine, only to watch him crash spectacularly to the earth. Years earlier, in the world of Red Dead Redemption 2, Arthur can find the wreckage of a different aircraft entirely, an early glider resting quietly and alone in the wilderness, its pilot nowhere to be found. It is a small, sad echo of that earlier story, suggesting that the dream of flight claimed more than one dreamer in this corner of the world, long before anyone ever truly mastered the sky. Whether players ever experienced the original game or not, finding the wreckage tends to land the same way, a quiet monument to ambition that outpaced the era's technology by several decades. The Sky Visitor. If Arthur happens to be in the right region of the map at exactly the right hour, deep in the dead of night, he may witness a bright and impossible light rising above the horizon. Riding closer reveals something that should not exist in 1899 at all. A glowing object hovering silently in the air, the unmistakable shape of a flying saucer. It does not attack, it does not speak. It simply hangs there, watching, before the light eventually fades and the night returns to its ordinary stillness, leaving Arthur alone again, with only the question of what he just witnessed. Most players only ever encounter it once across an entire playthrough, which is part of why so many newcomers initially assume they must have imagined the whole thing. The locomotive that should not exist. Travel to the northern reaches of Lemoyne sometime around 3 in the morning, and your horse will begin to grow uneasy beneath you. Ears pinned, hooves shifting nervously on the tracks. Moments later, a ghostly train comes roaring through, fully lit, fully formed, and utterly silent of any real engine sound. It vanishes as quickly as it appears, leaving no wreckage and no explanation. Given how closely it resembles a famous phantom locomotive boss battle from a beloved Super Nintendo role-playing game, it's reasonable to assume the writers were paying tribute to an older piece of gaming history. Though whatever the actual inspiration, the frontier clearly remembers ghosts of the rails that no longer run. Survivors of the encounter often describe a strange chill settling over the area moments before the train appears, almost as though the temperature itself remembers something the rest of the world has long since forgotten. The Hermit's Confession. In a hidden shack tucked away in Lemoyne, Arthur can discover an unfinished painting alongside strange, scrawled writing that references the plague-ridden ruins of Armadillo. Returning to this same shack again and again over time reveals that the painting is slowly completing itself brushstroke by impossible brushstroke, until at last it resolves into the face of a man, known only as the Strange Man. Reach full completion of the entire game's content, and visit his original cabin near Mattock Pond, and his portrait will finally finish, and his hat will be joined by his unsettling presence standing just behind your own reflection. Each visit demands patience rather than action, since nothing about the painting can be rushed or forced along any faster than the game intends. A glance in the mirror. Following the Strange Man's storyline to its conclusion rewards the patient player with one of the game's most genuinely unsettling moments. Standing before any mirror, after fully completing his arc, Arthur may catch a glimpse of a second figure standing silently behind him, gone the instant he turns to look. This same mysterious character first appeared in the original Red Dead Redemption, where John Marston discovered that bullets passed through him entirely. His true nature was never confirmed by the developers, only hinted at, leaving players to draw their own uneasy conclusions about who or what he actually is. Even players who already know exactly what to expect still describe a small jolt of unease the first time they actually see it happen for themselves. The Crying Woman of the Marsh, Blue Water Marsh, holds one of the more genuinely frightening encounters hidden across the map. Riding through at night, Arthur may come across either a sobbing woman standing alone or several bodies hanging silently from the trees nearby. Approaching either one is a mistake. The moment contact is made, shadowy figures known as night folk emerge from the darkness around you, and what felt like an act of compassion becomes a fight for survival. The encounter borrows heavily from horror folklore, populating an otherwise peaceful wetland with something far more sinister waiting just beneath the surface. The marsh itself seems to anticipate the encounter, growing thicker with fog and quieter with birdsong. The closer Arthur gets to whichever version of the scene happens to trigger that particular night. The Vampire's Trail. Deep within St. Denis, a careful explorer can find a series of 5 separate pieces of graffiti scattered through the city's back alleys, each one a small clue pointing towards something predatory lurking in the shadows. Following every clue to its conclusion eventually leads to a tense and genuinely creepy confrontation with a pale, fanged figure hiding in a darkened alleyway. The sequence is easy to miss entirely if you never think to read the walls of a city you are simply passing through, which makes finding it feel like uncovering a secret nobody told you was there. St. Denis at night already carries an uneasy atmosphere of gaslit streets and distant music, and this particular thread only deepens the sense that the city hides more than its busy daytime crowds would ever suggest. The Cave of Whispers. Big Valley hides a cave most players ride straight past without a second glance. Inside, deep in the dark, sits a strange and unsettling figure who refers to himself quite plainly as the Devil. He offers cryptic riddles and unsettling observations rather than any clear explanation of who or what he actually is. The encounter feels less like a quest and more like a fever dream stumbled into by accident, a reminder that the frontier still has corners that feel genuinely untouched by human reason. Most players who find it once make a habit of returning on later playthroughs, if only to hear whatever strange new thing the figure has to say this time around. The Monster in the Manor. Climb through the second-story window of a particular sinister home in the eastern reaches of New Hanover, near Roanoke Ridge, and Arthur will come face to face with a grotesque taxidermy creation, stitched together from the parts of multiple animals into something resembling a monstrous winged hybrid. In-game files refer to it as the man-made mutant, though players have long recognized it as an affectionate nod to a memorable cartoon monster. Reimagined here as the work of an unhinged frontier taxidermist with ambitions far beyond his skill. The detail of the wings is what truly sells the joke, since the original cartoon creature was never actually depicted as capable of flight in its own appearances. The Girl in the Outhouse. On the grounds of the Braithwaite estate, a locked outhouse holds one of the saddest secrets in the entire game. A woman's voice calls out from inside, distressed and afraid, the implication being that she was born with a disability and was hidden away by her own family out of shame. If Arthur never returns, her fate stays a mystery. But coming back later as John reveals the devastating truth, she was eventually forgotten entirely, left to starve, her body discovered only by a player curious enough to peer through the cracked wooden slats. It remains one of the quieter, more devastating moments in a game otherwise built around gunfights and grand betrayals, precisely because nothing about it asks to be noticed. The family secret at Gallagher Hall. The Gray family's stately home in Roanoke Ridge holds a quieter, more personal tragedy than most of the game's encounters. Exploring its rooms long enough reveals a family secret tied to a hidden lineage, one member of the household ultimately discovering they are descended from a spy working for the British Crown. The shame and shock of this discovery proves too much, and the encounter ends with a suicide inside the home. It's a small, easily missed storyline that trades horror for something closer to old-fashioned Southern Gothic tragedy. Compared to the more theatrical horror scattered elsewhere across the map, this one lands with an almost uncomfortable subtlety, closer to a stage drama than a ghost story. The Dinner Invitation. Near Aberdeen, a friendly-seeming man will call out to Arthur and invite him in to share a home-cooked meal with his wife. The conversation across the table grows steadily more uncomfortable, circling around topics no stranger should bring up so easily. It is, of course, a trap. The drink is drugged, and Arthur wakes hours later in a shallow pit, robbed and lucky to be alive at all. The two siblings running this farm are revealed to be far closer than family should be, an unsettling homage to the real-life Bender family, who lured travelers to their Kansas farmhouse with the same fatal hospitality during roughly the same era this game depicts. Even players who already suspect something is wrong from the moment of the initial invitation often find themselves drawn in anyway, if only out of morbid curiosity about how far the encounter will go. The Three Hermits. Scattered across the far reaches of the map are three separate hermits, each one a hostile loner guarding a stash of unique loot most players never think to look for. They do not wait politely to be discovered. Approach without caution and they will attack on sight, forcing a confrontation most players stumble into completely unprepared. Each hermit's reward is different, ranging from rare weapons to unusual trinkets, making the risk worthwhile for anyone patient enough to track all three down across the wilderness. Tracking down all three in a single playthrough has become something of an unofficial scavenger hunt among completionists who enjoy combing every inch of the map. The Meditating Monk. High in the East Grizzlies, near Cumberland Forest, a solitary monk sits cross-legged at the very top of the ridge, lost entirely in meditation. He will not respond to greetings, threats, or anything else Arthur says to him. He simply remains still, eyes closed, as the wind moves around him. The only way to disturb his peace is through outright dishonorable action. Otherwise, he offers nothing but a quiet moment shared at the top of the world. A small gift to any player patient, enough to climb up and simply sit beside him for a while. many players choose to simply sit nearby for a while themselves, treating the encounter less like a secret to solve and more like a small invitation to slow down. The Cauldron in New Amberino. Wandering through the lonely woods of Amberino, Arthur can stumble upon a small hut with a cauldron resting just outside it, the unmistakable visual shorthand for a witch's dwelling. No witch is ever found here. No further story unfolds. It exists purely as atmosphere, a single unsettling prop left in the wilderness to make players second guess what might be watching from the tree line, even when nothing actually is. It's the kind of detail easily missed entirely on a first playthrough, tucked far enough off any beaten path that stumbling onto it tends to feel like genuine luck rather than design. The Burning Outpost. Far to the north of Tumbleweed sits a small, unassuming house that seems, at first glance, like any other abandoned frontier dwelling. The moment a player actually discovers it, however, the structure suddenly and violently explodes, with no warning and no survivors to explain why. The timing and staging feel close enough to a nearly identical random encounter in a different post-apocalyptic survival game that many longtime fans assume it's a deliberate wink from Rockstar's writers, though this connection has never been officially confirmed one way or the other. Players who return to the same spot later will simply find a smoking ruin where the house once stood, with no further explanation offered for what happened there. The bridge that became a catapult. A long-standing exploit involving one particular bridge in the game allows players to manipulate physics in such a strange way that the bridge itself can be turned into a makeshift catapult, launching horses, wagons, or Arthur himself into the air. It was never an intended feature, simply a quirk of the game's physics engine colliding with player curiosity, but it has become a beloved accidental piece of frontier folklore passed down through years of online clips and tutorials. Years after release, footage of the trick still circulates online, proof that even a game this meticulously polished left just enough room for players to break it in genuinely entertaining ways. The birds wearing people, glitches involving misplaced animation skeletons are a long-running, almost affectionate tradition across the entire Red Dead series, and the franchise's earlier chaotic launches occasionally produced townsfolk whose human models moved with the flight patterns of birds, soaring unnaturally into the sky on limbs that should never have left the ground. Red Dead Redemption 2's own launch was comparatively far more polished thanks to its much longer development window, but the strange, glitchy folklore the series built in its earlier years still lingers in the minds of longtime fans whenever something on screen moves just a little too strangely to be intentional. It's the kind of glitch that becomes folklore in its own right, passed down through forums and old video clips long after the bug itself has actually been fixed. The Field of the Fallen Horses. An early and thoroughly disturbing glitch caused every single horse crossing one specific stretch of map to instantly drop dead the moment its hooves touched the ground. Riders would arrive at this unmarked patch of earth only to watch their mount collapse beneath them without warning, again and again, leaving an eerie pile of equine corpses accumulating in a place that should have been perfectly safe. It became, briefly, one of the most quietly horrifying things players could stumble into entirely by accident. Patch notes eventually addressed the issue, but for a brief window after launch, this particular stretch of road earned a small, dark reputation among players unlucky enough to discover it the hard way. The pig farm's real history. The unsettling siblings running the Aberdeen pig farm are far more than a creepy random encounter invented purely for shock value. Their entire setup, The isolated farmhouse, the friendly invitation, the drug dinner, and the shallow grave waiting outside deliberately mirrors the true story of the Bender family, a group of real frontier killers operating in Kansas during the very era this game recreates. Knowing the history behind the reference adds a layer of genuine unease to an encounter that already feels deeply wrong from the very first hello. Rockstar's writers clearly did their homework here, since several smaller details of the encounter line up closely with surviving historical accounts of the Bender family's actual crimes. The bones beneath Strawberry, returning to that mysterious collection of oversized bones north of Strawberry. Dedicated players have spent years debating their exact meaning. Some believe they represent nothing more than an oversized bear skeleton placed for atmosphere. Others insist the proportions are simply too far removed from any real animal native to the region. And based on what we know about the rest of the game's hidden content, it's not unreasonable to assume they're tied to the same long-running rumor of a hidden Bigfoot encounter buried somewhere in the game's files. Rockstar has never definitively confirmed either explanation, leaving the bones exactly where the mystery wants them, half buried and entirely open to interpretation. Online forums dedicated to the game still occasionally revive the debate years after release, a testament to how effectively a single unexplained prop can hold a community's imagination. The strange man's true identity. Years after the game's release, Rockstar co-founder Dan Houser finally addressed the long-running mystery surrounding the strange man's identity during a public conversation about the game's development. While the full context of his comments leaves some room for interpretation, Houser's remarks strongly suggested the character was always intended as something beyond a normal human being, an entity existing outside the rules governing everyone else on the frontier. Watching the Marston and Morgan families across two entire games for reasons that remain only partially explained, fans have spent years combing through his comments line by line, looking for any additional detail that might further confirm or complicate the character's exact nature. The legendary grizzly's first roar. Arthur's earliest brush with a legendary animal arrives during Chapter 2. Hunting alongside Hosea in the mission Exit, pursued by a bruised ego. The Bharati grizzly bear that confronts them is enormous, fast, and very likely to win the fight if Arthur is only carrying a pistol and a bow, which is all the mission typically provides. Most players are forced to retreat and return later with proper rifles in hand, making this the rare legendary animal that the story itself introduces before ever expecting you to actually defeat it. Many players remember this fight specifically because of how outmatched it feels, a deliberate bit of pacing meant to teach respect for the game's apex predators early. The Bull Gator's debut. Long before Arthur can legally hunt the legendary Bull Gator for its perfect, undamaged pelt, the beast actually appears within the main story itself, emerging from the swamps of Bayou NWA to terrorize Arthur, Dutch, and the rest of the gang during the Chapter 4 mission Country Pursuits. Only after surviving that encounter does the Bull Gator become available to track down properly in the wild, found just north of St. Denis near Lakay, where it remains the single most physically powerful legendary animal in the entire game. Surviving the mission encounter alone is often considered a small badge of honor among players who remember just how close the fight can come to going badly. The panther that demands patience. Of all 16 legendary animals scattered across the map, the legendary panther asks the most of any player hoping to find it. Known in-game as Giaguaro, it refuses to spawn at all until the player has completed 9 separate Master Hunter challenges, a slow grind through the game's hunting systems before the panther ever appears near Boulger Blade, south of Rhodes. Its rarity has made it something of a badge of honor among completionists. The final beast many players track down before calling their hunting career complete. Many dedicated hunters treat the moment the panther finally spawns as a genuine milestone, marking the unofficial end of their long grind through the game's hunting challenges. The coyote's quiet gift. The legendary coyote can be found roaming Scarlet Meadows, conveniently close to the gang's own camp near Rhodes, making it one of the more accessible legendary animals for players still early in their hunting career. Skinning it rewards both a pelt and a fang, the latter of which can be crafted into a trinket that boosts Deadeye experience gain by 10%. A small but genuinely useful edge for anyone planning to spend the rest of the game relying heavily on that slow-motion aiming system. Because the hunt requires so little detour from the gang's usual territory, it's often the very first legendary animal many players ever successfully bring down. The Fox in the Frost. North of Rhodes, near Mattock Pond, hunters can track down the legendary fox, a small and surprisingly fragile creature compared to its more dangerous legendary cousins. Its claw becomes a trinket that extends the duration of Eagle Eye, the tracking vision players rely on constantly while hunting, which makes the fox an early and practical target for anyone trying to make the rest of their legendary animal hunts considerably easier. Its relatively forgiving difficulty makes it a popular recommendation in community guides aimed at players just beginning to explore the game's legendary hunting system. The beaver's hidden value. Tucked away near Butcher Creek in New Hanover, not far from the Van Horn trading post, the legendary beaver might seem like an unusual choice for a rare and sought-after hunt, but its tooth becomes a trinket that slows weapon degradation by 10%. For a game built so heavily around maintaining gear and managing resources carefully, this small rodent quietly offers one of the more practical long-term advantages available to any dedicated outdoorsman willing to track it down. It's easy to underestimate this particular hunt simply because the animal itself looks so unassuming compared to bears, panthers, and alligators sharing the same map. The Bear of Grizzly's East. Beyond its introduction in the main story, the legendary grizzly bear can be hunted properly afterward in Grizzly's East, near O'Cree's Run. Bringing the proper firepower this time, rather than the meager pistol and bow from the original encounter, makes for a far more even fight. Its size and aggression still make it one of the more dangerous hunts in the early game. A reminder that even with better weapons, the grizzlies remain a place that demands real respect. Returning hunters often note just how differently the fight plays out once proper firepower replaces the desperate improvisation of that earlier story encounter. The Wolf of Katora Springs. Katora Springs hides more than just dramatic geysers and hidden treasure. It is also home to the legendary wolf, a hunt that builds directly on tracking techniques first taught during the earlier grizzly bear mission with Hosea. Successfully bringing the wolf down rewards a heart that crafts into a trinket, allowing Arthur to drink considerably more before suffering the usual penalties of being drunk. A strange but undeniably useful gift from one of the frontier's more feared predators. The surrounding geysers and unstable ground make the hunt feel more treacherous than most, adding genuine environmental tension on top of the wolf's own aggression. The white bison of Lake Isabella. Along the northern shore of Lake Isabella in Grizzly's West, the legendary white bison stands out instantly against the landscape with its pale, ghostly coat. Its horn becomes part of a talisman, requiring additional crafting materials beyond the animal itself. That reduces how quickly the stamina core drains during long rides and extended activity. For players who spend the bulk of the game on horseback crossing enormous distances, that stamina advantage proves more valuable than it might first appear. Its pale coat makes it visible from a considerable distance across the open snow. Though actually closing that distance without spooking, it still takes real patience. The ram of the Dakota River. Outside Valentine, wedged between the Dakota River and Cattail Pond, hunters can find the legendary bighorn ram, distinguished by oversized horns and a pale coat, unlike its ordinary counterparts. Its antler becomes a trinket, reducing the pelt quality penalty suffered when an animal is killed using the wrong weapon or without a clean headshot. A quiet bit of insurance for hunters who don't always have the perfect rifle ready in time. Its proximity to Valentine makes it one of the more convenient legendary hunts for players who haven't yet ventured far from the game's early hub town. The elk that runs from sound. East of Fort Wallace, below Bacchus Station, the legendary elk roams with a strikingly white coat and a nervous disposition that sends it bolting at the faintest noise. Most experienced hunters recommend a bow or a scoped rifle from a careful distance, since any clumsy approach sends the elk fleeing deep into terrain, where tracking it again becomes considerably harder. Its antler trinket rewards looted money, a fitting prize for an animal that demands real patience to bring down. Hunters who rush the approach almost always regret it, since the elk's nervous temperament punishes anything less than a slow, deliberate stalk. The boar of Blue Water Marsh, sharing territory with some of the game's spookier encounters. The legendary boar can be found at the edge of Blue Water Marsh in the northeastern corner of Lemoyne. Its tusk joins the long list of craftable trinkets drawn from these 16 rare creatures, each contributing some small mechanical advantage to a player's long and dangerous life on the frontier. Proof that even the swamp's more mundane residents carry their own quiet rewards. Tracking it down means braving the same unsettling fog and distant cries that make the rest of Blue Water Marsh such an uneasy place to linger after dark. The moose of the Northern Rails. Following the train tracks north from Annesburg leads hunters toward Roanoke Ridge, where the legendary moose makes its home along the western shore of the Kamassa River. Its size alone makes it an imposing target, and its presence in such a remote, often overlooked corner of Ambarino means many players miss it entirely unless they specifically go looking, making it one of the more satisfying discoveries for anyone willing to ride that far north. Its sheer size makes for one of the more visually striking trophies among the 16, towering noticeably over the common moose sharing its territory. The alligator of Lagras Lake. On the western shore of Lagras Lake in Lemoyne, the legendary alligator lurks just beneath the waterline, a stealthy predator that demands caution from anyone approaching its territory on foot. Like all of its legendary counterparts, its pelt remains perfect and undamaged regardless of the weapon used to bring it down, a small mercy that rewards hunters even when the fight itself turns messy and chaotic. Players who underestimate how quickly it can close distance in open water often learn the hard way why caution is recommended around its territory. The cougar's deadly speed. West of Tumbleweed, near Gaptooth Ridge in New Austin, the legendary cougar prowls with a speed that makes it notoriously difficult to land a clean shot against. Most experienced hunters recommend entering the encounter with a fully charged dead-eye meter, since the cougar closes distance fast enough to turn hesitation into a serious problem. Its difficulty has made it something of a rite of passage among players working their way through all 16 legendary hunts. Its reputation among the hunting community as one of the toughest fights in the entire roster is well earned. given how little margin for error it actually leaves. The pronghorn of New Austin, southeast of Fort Mercer, in the dusty reaches of Rio Bravo, the legendary pronghorn waits in territory that remains genuinely dangerous until the player reaches the game's epilogue chapters. Earlier attempts to access this area as Arthur risked drawing fire from unseen snipers patrolling New Austin, meaning this particular hunt effectively waits for John Marston's portion of the story before it can be completed safely. Many players simply choose to wait out the danger entirely, treating the animal as unfinished business to revisit once the story safely reopens the region. The Tatanka bison's old bloodline. In the meadows of southern New Austin, near Hennigan Stead, the legendary Tatanka bison roams with a darker, shaggier coat than its common cousins. Its horn becomes a trinket, reducing melee damage taken, a practical benefit for anyone who finds themselves regularly brawling in saloons or alleyways across the frontier. Like the pronghorn, this hunt becomes far safer once the epilogue opens New Austin up properly for exploration. Its darker coat makes it easy to distinguish from a distance, assuming a hunter is patient enough to wait for New Austin to become safe to explore. The 16th beast, altogether, Red Dead Redemption. 2 hides 16 separate legendary animals across its enormous map, each one rarer, faster, and more dangerous than the common wildlife sharing its territory. Only 5 are technically required for full game completion, yet dedicated hunters often pursue all 16 anyway, drawn by the perfect, undamaged pelts and the unique trinkets and talismans each creature provides, turning what could have been a simple checklist into one of the most quietly rewarding side activities the entire game offers. Community-compiled checklists and interactive maps have become genuinely popular tools among players determined to track down every last one without missing a single location. The decade before release, work on Red Dead Redemption 2 began almost immediately after the original Red Dead Redemption shipped in 2010, with Rockstar co-founder Dan Houser speaking to the original development studio about a possible sequel as early as 2011. By late that same year, the team had only a broad outline and a rough sense of the story's flow. It would take roughly 8 more years of steady, often grueling work before the finished game ever reached a single player's hands. Looking back, that early uncertainty makes the game's eventual scope feel even more remarkable, since nobody involved at the very start could have known how massive it would ultimately become. The studio that became one. Rather than splitting development across its many global studios the way previous titles had been built, Rockstar made the unusual decision to merge every single one of its offices into a single unified team for Red Dead Redemption 2, simply branded as Rockstar Games rather than any individual studio name. This consolidation allowed the company to pull talent from wherever it happened to be strongest, hiring the best people for each specific job, regardless of which city or country they called home. It was a notable departure from how the company had historically organized itself, and many credit that restructuring with helping the finished game feels so consistently realized from region to region. The script stacked 8 feet high. According to producer Rob Nelson, the combined volume of Red Dead Redemption 2's main story script, its side missions, and its countless ambient pedestrian conversations would form a physical stack of paper roughly 8 feet tall if printed and piled together. The core narrative script alone reportedly ran past 2,000 pages, not even counting an additional 80 pages dedicated purely to background chatter between strangers passing each other on the street. Even players who spend hundreds of hours exploring every corner of the map will likely never hear every single line that script actually contains. The sequel nobody expected. When the original Red Dead Redemption launched in 2010, Rockstar reportedly had no real expectation that the game would be successful enough to justify a true sequel. That uncertainty is part of why Arthur Morgan, despite being central to the entire story, is never once mentioned anywhere in the first game, since the character and his story simply didn't exist yet in any concrete form when that earlier game was being written and recorded. That early uncertainty becomes especially poignant in hindsight, given how thoroughly Arthur's story would eventually come to define the franchise for an entirely new generation of players. The tribute hidden in a trail. Name. During production, motion capture and voice actor John O'Cree, who portrayed the beloved camp member known as Uncle, passed away unexpectedly from complications related to a blood clot. Rather than removing his presence from the game entirely, Rockstar chose to honor him by naming a real location on the in-game map, O'Cree's Run in Grizzly's East, after the actor, ensuring a small piece of his memory remains permanently woven into the world he helped bring to life. It's a quiet, permanent piece of memorial tucked into a corner of the map most players ride through without ever learning the story behind its name. The voice that lived on. While most of O'Cree's recorded dialogue had to be re-recorded by his replacement, actor James McBride, one specific piece of audio survived entirely intact in the finished game. Uncle's singing voice during the joyful celebration scene after Beecher's Hope Ranch is finally completed. It stands as the last surviving piece of O'Cree's actual performance reaching players, a quiet, musical farewell tucked into one of the story's warmest moments. Longtime fans of the character often point to that single surviving recording as one of the more genuinely moving small details buried anywhere in the game. The replacement almost his twin. In a strange and almost poetic coincidence, James McBride, the actor who stepped in to finish voicing Uncle after O'Cree's passing, was only a single year younger than the man he was replacing. O'Cree died at 67, while McBride himself was 66 at the time. Two veteran performers of nearly identical age. One finishing the journey, the other had been forced to leave unfinished. It's the kind of coincidence that feels almost scripted, though by every account it was simply a strange and fitting accident of timing. The 8-foot crunch controversy. In the lead-up to the game's release, Dan Houser publicly mentioned that certain members of the team had worked weeks featuring roughly 100 hours of labor, a comment that ignited widespread concern over labor practices within the studio. Rockstar later clarified that this intensity applied specifically to its senior writing staff over a brief 3-week stretch, rather than the entire workforce across the full 8 years of production. And the company subsequently released its average reported employee work hours for different quarters of 2018, showing figures hovering in the mid-40s on a weekly basis across most of the year. Whether those numbers fully captured the experience of every individual developer remained a point of ongoing debate among current and former staff who spoke publicly about the production afterward. The episode became something of a flashpoint for broader industry conversations that continued well beyond the game's own release. The actor, with an unexpected accent. When Roger Clark accepted his award for delivering what many critics consider the finest voice performance in the entire game as Arthur Morgan, audiences were surprised to hear him speaking with a notably thick Irish accent, rather than the rugged American drawl they associated with his character. Clark was actually born in the United States, but spent much of his upbringing in Ireland, making his eventual performance as a quintessential American outlaw all the more impressive in hindsight. It's a detail many longtime fans only discover after going out of their way to seek out behind-the-scenes interviews and award acceptance footage. The return of John Marston's voice. Actor. Rob Wythoff originally voiced John Marston in the very first Red Dead Redemption, but by 2013 he had stepped away from acting entirely to focus on raising his family. The opportunity to reprise the role for Red Dead Redemption 2 pulled him back into the industry years later, and most fans agree the game benefited enormously from his return, since any other actor attempting to recreate Marston's voice would likely have felt like an entirely different character altogether. Wythoff has since spoken about how strange and rewarding it felt to step back into a character he never expected to revisit after walking away from acting entirely. The composer who returned, musician Woody Jackson, who had already composed the original score for both the first Red Dead Redemption and Grand Theft Auto V, returned once again to craft the haunting, atmospheric music underpinning Red Dead Redemption 2's frontier. His score drew on contributions from a striking and eclectic range of artists, including experimental musicians whose work gave the soundtrack a texture far stranger and more haunting than a typical Western score might suggest. That continuity helped give the sequel's soundtrack a sense of musical lineage, connecting it sonically to the games that came immediately before it. The vocal sessions behind the songs, producer Daniel Lanois was brought in specifically to oversee the original vocal tracks woven throughout the game's world, working alongside an unusually varied lineup of musicians including D'Angelo, Willie Nelson, Rhiannon Giddens, and Josh Homme. The result is a soundtrack that constantly shifts between genuine period authenticity and something more modern and unexpected, mirroring the game's own balance between historical grounding and creative invention. Several of these tracks only play during specific story missions, rewarding attentive players who notice just how carefully the music has been matched to the moment. The announcement that moved markets. Before Red Dead Redemption 2 was even officially confirmed, Rockstar's social media accounts quietly began posting a handful of Western-themed teaser images, a deliberately understated tease that nonetheless caused a measurable bump in parent company Take-Two's stock value. It is a small but telling reminder of just how much commercial weight Rockstar's announcements alone could carry, even before a single official detail had been revealed. It remains a striking example of just how much anticipation a single, carefully managed studio could generate with nothing more than a handful of moody teaser images. The 8 feet of pages, 5 hours cut. Beyond the staggering size of the finished script, Rockstar reportedly cut roughly 5 additional hours of completed gameplay content during development, alongside an entirely separate storyline involving a potential love interest for Arthur Morgan that never made it into the final release. The sheer scale of material left on the cutting room floor hints at just how much larger and more sprawling this story could have been. Houser's public comments about the cuts have only fueled ongoing fan speculation about what an even longer version of Arthur's story might have looked like. The father who never made it. Among the unused story threads cut from the final game was a storyline in which Arthur would have fathered a child who died very early in the narrative, a tragic beat that was ultimately removed before release. Co-founder Dan Houser later discussed this and other abandoned ideas publicly, offering fans a rare glimpse into just how many different emotional directions Arthur's story might have taken before settling into the version players ultimately experienced. Fans who learned about the cut storyline after the fact have spent considerable time speculating about how differently Arthur's arc might have unfolded with that loss woven into it. The disease drawn from family history. Arthur Morgan's slow, devastating decline from tuberculosis throughout the back half of the story was not simply a dramatic device pulled from thin air. Dan Hauser later revealed that his own grandfather had contracted tuberculosis before effective antibiotics existed, shortly after Hauser's own father was born. That personal family history directly informed the writer's decision to give Arthur an illness that allows him to remain conscious and active even as his body steadily fails him. Since the disease's gradual progression gave the writers room to build an entire final act around a man forced to reckon honestly with the violence of his past, while still possessing enough strength and time to try to do some good before the end finally arrives. Hauser has described the choice as one of the more personal decisions made anywhere in the writing process, drawing directly from his own family's experience with the same illness. The budget behind The Frontier. Industry analysts have estimated that the combined development and marketing costs behind Red Dead Redemption 2 fell somewhere between $370 million and $540 million, figures that place it among the most expensive entertainment products ever created in any medium. Those staggering numbers help explain both the unprecedented scope of the finished world and the enormous commercial pressure riding on its eventual release. Comparisons to blockbuster film budgets of the same era only underscore just how unusual a project of this financial scale was within the games industry at the time. The 3-Day Fortune. Despite its massive budget, Red Dead Redemption 2 recouped an extraordinary amount of that investment almost immediately, reportedly grossing roughly $725 million within its first 3 days on shelves alone. That kind of immediate financial return placed it firmly among the most successful entertainment launches in history, video game or otherwise, validating years of difficult, expensive, and often grueling production. Numbers of that scale place the game in conversation with some of the biggest entertainment openings of any kind, film included, during that same calendar year. The credits behind the curtain. Rockstar's own published thank you letter following the game's release credited a total of 3,168 individual people for their work on the project. Once the additional 1,200 motion capture and voice actors are factored in separately, the true total number of people who contributed in some form to bringing Red Dead Redemption 2 to life climbs to somewhere around 4,368. Sitting through the full credit sequence offers a rare, tangible sense of just how many hands were genuinely required to build a world this large. The single protagonist decision, coming directly off the heels of Grand Theft Auto 5, which had famously let players control 3 separate protagonists. Rockstar made a deliberate choice to scale Red Dead Redemption 2 back down to a single playable character in Arthur Morgan. The team felt that the emotional, character-driven nature of a Western story demanded a tighter, more personal connection between player and protagonist than splitting perspective across multiple outlaws could ever really provide. That choice ultimately shaped nearly every storytelling decision that followed, since the entire game could be built around a single, deeply personal arc, rather than splitting attention across competing perspectives. The family that falls apart. Where the original Red Dead Redemption built its entire emotional core around John Marston's desperate attempt to protect his family at any cost, Red Dead Redemption 2 was deliberately written as something close to its emotional opposite, the slow, painful unraveling of a family that no longer believes it can hold itself together. Writer Michael Unsworth has spoken about this thematic inversion as one of the foundational ideas that shaped the entire narrative from its earliest stages. Reading the two games side by side, longtime fans often note just how deliberately the sequel inverts nearly every major theme the original game built its identity around. The 22 strangers made family. To breathe genuine life into the 22 distinct members of the Van der Linde gang surrounding Arthur, Rockstar's writers spent significant time crafting individual backstories explaining who each character was before joining Dutch's outfit, and why exactly they chose to stay even as things grew increasingly dangerous. According to the development team, every single character was considered structurally necessary, with only a small handful of additional personalities cut entirely during earlier drafts for failing to add enough to the larger story. That level of care is part of why so many players report genuinely grieving fictional characters by the time the credits finally roll. The camp built to feel alive. One of the quieter technical achievements behind Red Dead Redemption 2 involves the gang's camp itself, which was built to run on a believable internal schedule rather than simply populating characters as static decorations waiting for the player to interact with them. According to producer Rob Nelson, the team wanted living inside this camp to feel genuinely real, with gang members eating, sleeping, arguing and drinking according to routines that exist whether or not Arthur happens to be watching. Spend enough idle time wandering the camp and distinct daily rhythms start to emerge, lending the whole space a believability that few open-world games bother to attempt. The careful line around John. Because John Marston had already become such a beloved figure from the first Red Dead Redemption, the writing team behind the sequel were deliberately careful not to lean too heavily on his presence within Arthur's story. Producer Rob Nelson has described this balancing act using a memorable phrase, cautioning the team against Johnning it up too much, ensuring Arthur's own arc could stand entirely on its own rather than constantly borrowing emotional weight from a character players already knew and loved. That restraint paid off, since Arthur ultimately emerged as one of the most beloved protagonists in the studio's history, without ever needing to borrow goodwill from his predecessor. The mural that tells the future. Hidden within the game's world is a painted mural depicting a series of historical events, some that have already occurred by 1899, and others that appear to foreshadow moments still to come within the broader Red Dead timeline. Eagle-eyed players have spent years cross-referencing its imagery against real history and the events of the first Red Dead Redemption, treating it almost like a puzzle box of foreshadowing left deliberately vague enough to reward repeated careful viewing rather than a single quick glance. Dedicated lore communities have built entire threads and videos attempting to decode every individual panel, treating the mural almost like a riddle Rockstar left intentionally unsolved. The Senators. Wearing different faces, several of the game's fictional politicians are widely believed to be thinly veiled stand-ins for real historical American figures from the same era. A senator named Thaddeus Waxman carries unmistakable echoes of Theodore Roosevelt, while other fictional officials mirror earlier presidents such as Martin Van Buren and William McKinley. These quiet historical parallels reward players who already have some familiarity with turn-of-the-century American politics, layering a second, subtler story underneath the game's purely fictional one. Spotting every parallel requires at least a passing familiarity with the actual political figures of the era, rewarding history-minded players with an extra layer of satire most others simply ride past. The names borrowed from real mysteries, Roanoke Ridge and Roanoke Valley, take their names directly from one of early American history's most enduring unsolved mysteries, the vanished 16th century settlement known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke. Rockstar's choice to borrow that name for an isolated, fog-shrouded corner of its own map feels entirely deliberate, lending an extra unspoken weight of historical dread to a region already filled with ghost stories and strange disappearances of its own. The choice fits neatly alongside the game's broader pattern of borrowing real, often unsettling pieces of American history and quietly folding them into its fictional geography. The heist gone wrong, echoed from film, the entire backbone of Red Dead Redemption 2's plot, a botched robbery whose chaotic fallout the player spends the whole story untangling, bears a close resemblance to the structure of the 1992 crime film Reservoir Dogs. Both stories revolve around a heist the audience never actually witnesses. Both feature a trigger-happy member whose recklessness blows the job apart, and both build toward a tense, multi-sided standoff at the very end. Rockstar has never explicitly confirmed the connection, but the parallels run close enough that many longtime fans consider it one of the clearest cinematic fingerprints on the entire game. Watching the film after finishing the game makes the parallel almost impossible to miss, right down to the shared sense of paranoia simmering between characters who no longer trust one another. The letter from a rejected author. Outside Roads, a stagecoach passenger can be found carrying a letter referencing a struggling author whose novel was reportedly turned down by a dozen different publishers before finally finding success. The detail is widely understood as a playful nod to J.K. Rowling, whose own path to publishing the first Harry Potter novel involved exactly that kind of repeated rejection before the story eventually became one of the best-selling in modern history. It's a small, clever piece of writing trivia tucked into an otherwise forgettable side encounter, rewarding players who actually stop to read what they've picked up. The gazebo joke. During the side mission chain known as the Course of True Love, Arthur can be heard muttering a complaint about how many gazebos one town truly needs as he searches for the correct one among several identical structures. The joke is a direct, knowing wink toward a similarly absurd running gag from a beloved American sitcom, dropped into the middle of an otherwise heartfelt romantic side quest, without ever calling attention to itself. Fans of the referenced sitcom tend to catch the joke instantly, while everyone else simply enjoys watching Arthur's patience wear thin over something so trivial. The numbers in the wood. After John Marston's house is finally completed during the game's epilogue, a careful look at the planks laid out nearby reveals a sequence of numbers spelled out in the wood itself. That specific number sequence has been used as a recurring hidden reference across numerous video games, dating back to a survival horror title from the mid-1990s, making its quiet appearance here a small thread connecting Red Dead Redemption 2 to decades of gaming history far outside its own genre. It's a tiny, almost invisible piece of gaming history smuggled into a quiet domestic scene that has nothing else to do with horror or survival at all. The origin in a stolen wallet. Long before any of the events Arthur Morgan witnesses, the entire Van der Linde gang began with a single, almost comedic moment of mutual dishonesty. Dutch Van der Linde and a small-time con man named Hosea Matthews crossed paths at a campfire on the road to Chicago sometime in the mid-1870s, and Hosea attempted to rob Dutch outright, only to realize partway through that Dutch had already quietly picked his own pocket in return. Rather than coming to blows, the two men simply laughed at how evenly matched they were, and a criminal partnership that would eventually grow into an entire outlaw family was born from nothing more than two thieves recognizing a kindred spirit, It is a strangely gentle, almost playful beginning for a story that will eventually end in so much grief. And it is easy to imagine the two of them that night, having no real idea how far their small partnership would grow, or how many lives would one day depend on the trust they built around that single shared fire. The jail cell that started everything. Dutch and Hosea's early partnership wasn't all smooth schemes and clever cons. The pair eventually found themselves locked up in an Ohio jail cell after one of their fraud schemes went badly wrong. A humbling setback for two men who clearly believed themselves smarter than the law around them. Their eventual escape from custody set the stage for the very next chapter of their story, since it was shortly afterward that they crossed paths with a hungry orphan teenager who would change the entire direction of their lives. That early brush with the law is rarely mentioned again later in the story, but it quietly establishes just how long Dutch and Hosea had been improvising their way out of trouble even before Arthur ever entered the picture. The 14-year-old they took in. Arthur Morgan was only 14 years old when Dutch and Hosea first found him, an orphan with nowhere else to turn and nothing resembling a stable home. The two older men took him under their wing, not as hired muscle, but as something closer to a son, teaching him to read, to shoot, and eventually to think the way they thought about freedom, government, and the kind of life worth living outside the rules of ordinary society. That early, almost paternal bond is part of what makes Arthur's later disillusionment with Dutch feel so devastating by the time the story catches up to him. Knowing just how young and vulnerable Arthur was, when the two men found him recontextualizes nearly every scene of loyalty and resentment that follows between them. The boy saved from the noose. Several years after taking in young Arthur, the gang crossed paths with another desperate child, a 12-year-old named John Marston, who was, by most accounts, about to be hanged for stealing. Dutch and Hosea intervened and brought the boy into their growing family instead, giving him the same kind of unconventional education they had already given Arthur. The two boys effectively grew up as brothers within the gang, with Arthur as the older sibling, looking out for a younger, more reckless John throughout much of their shared childhood. That shared history of rescue is part of why both men, however strained their relationship becomes later, never quite stop feeling responsible for one another. The anachronism, hiding in the backstory, buried within the game's deep lore, is a small, almost invisible historical slip. According to the backstory, Dutch and Hosea pulled off a job together in the town of Kettering, Ohio, around 1877. The trouble is that Kettering didn't actually receive that name until 1952, when it was formally named after automotive inventor Charles F. Kettering. It's a tiny continuity error buried so deep in supplementary lore that even most dedicated fans have never noticed it. A rare crack in Rockstar's otherwise meticulous historical research. Errors like this are genuinely rare across the game's enormous body of supplementary material, which only makes this particular slip stand out more once someone actually goes looking for it. The feud that started with a woman. Long before Colm O'Driscoll became one of Dutch's most bitter rivals, the seeds of that hatred were planted by a woman named Annabelle, whose exact relationship with Dutch was never fully explained, but widely believed to have been romantic. After Dutch killed Colm's own brother during an earlier conflict between the two gangs, Colm retaliated by killing Annabelle in turn, locking the two outlaw leaders into a cycle of revenge that would echo for years and eventually spill directly into the events Arthur experiences. The fact that so much of this history is only ever alluded to in passing dialogue makes the feud feel less like a tidy backstory and more like an old wound that simply never had the chance to heal. The wife Hosea lost. Hosea Matthews, the gang's clever and aging co-founder, carries a quiet personal tragedy that the game only mentions in passing. He once had a wife named Bessie, and the two of them genuinely attempted to leave the outlaw life behind entirely, hoping for something steadier and safer. Bessie died before the events of the main story, and her loss is part of why Hosea eventually drifted back into a life of crime alongside Dutch. No longer having a reason to chase the quieter future he and Bessie once imagined together. It's a small but telling piece of backstory that recasts Hosea's easy humor throughout the game as something closer to a coping mechanism than genuine, carefree contentment. The kidnapped child who became an outlaw. Tilly Jackson's path into the gang is one of the story's darkest origin tales, rarely discussed outside dedicated law circles. At only 12 years old, she was kidnapped by a vicious group known as the Foreman Brothers Gang, who abused her for an extended period before she finally fought back, killing the cousin of the gang's own leader, Malcolm Foreman, in order to escape. That brutal childhood shaped the guarded, hardened woman players eventually meet riding alongside Dutch's gang years later. Knowing this history adds considerable weight to her quieter, more wary moments throughout the story, even when the game itself never directly references what she survived. The Reverend who saved Dutch. Swanson's continued presence within the gang, despite his obvious struggles with alcohol and morphine, makes far more sense once his actual history is understood. At some point before the story begins, Swanson is believed to have talked Dutch out of an extremely dangerous confrontation. Likely inside a saloon Dutch was attempting to rob through charm, rather than force. Dutch reportedly considers himself permanently in the Reverend's debt for that intervention, which is part of why a man so visibly struggling with his own demons is still welcome around the campfire. That debt helps explain a loyalty that otherwise seems strange, given how little practical use Swanson appears to offer the gang for most of the story. The Navy man turned camp cook. Simon Pearson's quiet, easygoing presence as the gang's cook hides a far rougher personal history than his calm demeanor suggests. After a brief stint in the Navy that ended poorly, Pearson found himself deeply indebted to loan sharks and in serious danger. Dutch, taking a liking to both Pearson's storytelling and his genuine skill in the kitchen, rescued him from that situation and brought him into the fold, giving the gang one of its steadiest and longest-serving members in the process. It's a fitting origin for a character whose entire role in camp revolves around steadiness and care, qualities that clearly mattered just as much to Dutch as raw usefulness in a fight. The court jester nobody could explain. Unlike most members of the gang, whose backstories are at least loosely sketched out somewhere in dialogue or supplementary material, Uncle's reasons for joining remain almost entirely a mystery. The game never directly explains how or why Dutch found him, though the most common theory among longtime fans is that Dutch simply found Uncle's drunken antics amusing enough to bring him along anyway, treating him less like hired muscle and more like a permanent source of entertainment around camp. That lack of explanation has become something of a running joke within the fan community itself, treated almost as fitting for a character who never seems to take anything, including his own backstory, especially seriously. The survivalist raised by two worlds. Charles Smith's upbringing gave him a unique resilience compared to most of his fellow gang members. Born to an African-American father and a Native American mother, Charles spent much of his early life within his mother's tribal community, learning hunting and survival skills that would later define his role within Dutch's gang. That community was eventually torn apart by the US Army, and Charles's father fell into alcoholism in the aftermath, leaving Charles to build his own quiet, deeply principled code of honor largely on his own terms. That dual heritage and the loss that followed it help explain why Charles so often seems like the moral center of a gang otherwise drifting further from any consistent code at all. The brothers who never made it. Before the story Arthur experiences even begins, 2 more gang members met their end during the disastrous Blackwater ferry heist that sets the entire plot into motion. The Callender brothers, Mac and Davy, were both swept up in the chaos of that failed robbery. Mac was captured by Pinkerton agent Milton during the escape, while Davy was mortally wounded and ultimately died once the gang reached the snowy safety of the Grizzlies, making him one of the earliest casualties of the gang's slow unraveling. Their deaths are mentioned only briefly in early dialogue, yet they set the emotional tone for an entire story that will spend the next several years quietly counting down its own members. The member who never appears. Among every single character ever associated with the Van der Linde gang, Mac Callander holds a strange and unique distinction. He is the only member never actually shown in any form whatsoever. Not in person, not in artwork, and not even memorialized with a gravestone the way so many other fallen members eventually are. He exists purely through dialogue references, a gang member players hear about constantly, but are never actually permitted to see for themselves. That absence has made him something of a curiosity among dedicated lore fans, who often point to him as proof of just how much unseen history the writers built around even the most minor figures. The tallest in camp. Among the entire roster of the Van der Linde gang, only 2 members share the distinction of being the tallest, standing at exactly 5 feet 11 inches. Those 2 men are Arthur Morgan and Dutch Van der Linde himself. An oddly fitting bit of trivia given how closely their fates and philosophies remain intertwined throughout the story, even as Arthur's loyalty toward his mentor steadily crumbles across the narrative's later chapters. It's the kind of small, almost invisible design choice that subtly reinforces the bond between the 2 men, long before the story ever puts that bond into words. The heaviest man at the fire. If you've ever wondered who among the gang would win in a contest of pure physical mass, the answer is Simon Pearson, the camp's resident cook, who reportedly weighs in at 196 pounds, making him the heaviest documented member of the entire Van der Linde gang. It's a small, almost throwaway piece of character data buried in the game's files, but it adds a surprisingly tangible sense of physicality to a character mostly known for his stew and his stories. Details like this rarely surface anywhere in actual dialogue. Existing purely as background data, the developers clearly tracked for their own internal consistency. The only 3 who served in uniform. Of the entire sprawling cast surrounding Arthur, only 3 gang members carry confirmed military service in their backstories. Simon Pearson served in the Navy before joining the gang, while both Bill Williamson and Kieran Duffy served in the Army, with Bill having been dishonorably discharged before falling into the violent, frustrated existence that eventually led him to Dutch. That shared thread of military history, scattered quietly across otherwise very different men, adds another small layer of realism to a cast built from genuinely lived-in backstories. It's a detail that rewards close listening to camp dialogue, since none of these 3 ever make a particularly big deal out of their own service. The death toll by the numbers, tallying every member of the Van der Linde gang across both games by the most commonly cited fan accounting, reveals a genuinely staggering body count. 3 members die before the events of Red Dead Redemption 2 even begin. 7 more die during Arthur's own portion of the story. And 4 additional members meet their end by the close of the epilogue, bringing the total number of gang-related deaths within the second game alone to 14, based on how most longtime fans have chosen to count it. It is a sobering reminder of just how thoroughly this found family is dismantled by the time the credits eventually roll. Laid out in a single tally like this, the scale of loss becomes far more striking than it ever feels, while simply playing through the story one chapter at a time. The cult of personality. Several writers and longtime fans have described the gang's devotion to Dutch using language that borders on religious, rather than simply professional loyalty. Bill and Javier in particular express something close to genuine reverence toward their leader throughout the story, and Dutch himself actively encourages this dynamic, repeatedly calling out anyone who dares to express doubt about his decisions. That near-total faith in one flawed, increasingly desperate man is ultimately part of what allows the gang's slow collapse to spiral as badly as it eventually does. Viewed through that lens, much of the gang's later infighting starts to look less like simple disagreement and more like a crisis of faith among people who built their entire identity around one man's word. The Robin Hood code that slowly died. In the gang's earlier, more idealistic years, Dutch genuinely operated by something resembling a moral code, targeting the wealthy and avoiding unnecessary bloodshed wherever possible. Arthur even recalls getting into trouble with Dutch at one point for accidentally stealing from someone too poor to be a fair target. That code erodes steadily and visibly across the events of the main story, until the gang that once prided itself on restraint finds itself committing exactly the kind of indiscriminate violence its founder once claimed to despise. Tracking that erosion across the story's chapters is one of the more quietly devastating threads running underneath everything else happening on the surface. The writer who found peace. Among the gang's eventual survivors, Mary Beth Gaskell's fate stands out as one of the quieter, happy endings buried within the epilogue. Rather than continuing a life of crime or violence, she goes on to become a published romance novelist, channeling the dramatic, emotionally turbulent years she spent living alongside outlaws into a creative career entirely removed from the danger that once defined her daily life. It's a fitting conclusion for a character the game frequently shows scribbling in a notebook, suggesting the writing instinct was there long before the gang's collapse ever gave her the freedom to actually pursue it. The cook who opened a shop. Simon Pearson, the same heavy-set former Navy man who spent years feeding the gang from a travelling chuck wagon, eventually settles down in Rhodes during the epilogue and opens his own general store. It's a fittingly domestic conclusion for a character whose entire role within the gang revolved around feeding and caring for everyone else. Finally given the chance to build something stable and permanent of his own, once the chaos of outlaw life finally ends. Players who visit his store in the epilogue can still hear traces of the same warm, talkative personality that defined him back at camp, now simply applied to running a business instead of a chuck wagon. The snitch who started his own empire. After the Van der Linde gang's final, catastrophic collapse, Micah Bell doesn't simply vanish into obscurity. He goes on to form an entirely new gang of his own, pulling in former associates Cleet and Joe, and according to in-game newspapers, his fresh wave of criminal activity grows feared enough across West Elizabeth that journalists openly compared his lawlessness to that of Dutch van der Linde himself. A darkly fitting outcome for the man whose betrayal helped destroy the original gang in the first place. There's a bitter irony in Micah essentially becoming the very thing he helped tear down, right down to inheriting the same kind of newspaper notoriety Dutch once carried. The loyal outlaw, who said nothing, Strauss, the gang's morally questionable debt collector, ends up captured by Pinkerton agents at some point before 1907 and is reportedly tortured in an attempt to extract information about the gang's remaining members and whereabouts. Despite having technically been pushed out of the gang earlier in the story, Strauss never breaks under that pressure, choosing loyalty to people who had already abandoned him over his own safety, and ultimately dying in custody without ever giving the Pinkertons what they wanted. It's a surprisingly noble end for a character players spend most of the story actively disliking, complicating any simple read on his place within the larger group. The Beast with 20%. Among all the trinkets and talismans hidden across the frontier, one stands above the rest in pure practical value. The Ravenclaw talisman doesn't require hunting a single legendary animal at all. Instead, crafted from an old brass compass, earned by locating every hidden rock carving scattered across the map. Once assembled, it slows weapon degradation across Arthur's entire arsenal by a full 20%, doubling the benefit of similar trinkets and rewarding the kind of patient, observant exploration the game quietly encourages throughout its world. Dedicated players often treat the full set of rock carvings as a personal scavenger hunt, long before they ever realize a meaningful reward is waiting at the end of it. The compass that replaces a claw. What makes the Ravenclaw talisman especially unusual compared to nearly every other crafted item in the game is that it asks nothing of the player's hunting skills whatsoever. While most talismans demand a perfect part harvested from one of the 16 legendary animals, this particular reward comes purely from curiosity and exploration, tracking down a series of ancient carvings tucked into cliffsides and rock faces that most players never think to search for unless they already know they exist. Community-made maps marking every carving location have become a popular resource precisely because the carvings themselves are so easy to ride straight past without noticing. The handcuffs that demand patience. Few crafted items in the entire game require quite as much dedication as the alligator tooth talisman. Beyond hunting down the legendary alligator itself, players must also track down a gold-jointed bracelet and an entire set of collectible cigarette cards, which must then be mailed away in order to receive a pair of vintage Civil War handcuffs as a reward. Only once every single piece is finally assembled does the talisman become available, permanently slowing the drain on Arthur's dead-eye core by 10% for an enormous amount of patient effort. The sheer number of separate steps involved makes this one of the more satisfying talismans to finally complete, precisely because so little of it can be rushed. The bear that reduces hunger. The Bear Claw talisman, crafted from a silver chain bracelet, a chunk of quartz, and the claw of the legendary grizzly bear, slows the drain rate of Arthur's health core, allowing him to go considerably longer without eating or resting. For players who frequently forget to manage their hunger meter during long stretches of exploration or combat, this single talisman quietly removes one of the more persistent annoyances of the game's otherwise demanding survival systems. It's frequently recommended in community guides as one of the first talismans worth pursuing, simply because its benefit is felt during nearly every single hour spent playing afterward. The shark hiding in a shipwreck. Not every trinket in the game requires elaborate crafting at all. East of Ansburg, hidden inside a lockbox near a wrecked ship just offshore, sits the shark tooth trinket, ready to be claimed the moment a player simply finds it. Equipping its passive bonus permanently increases the rate at which Arthur bonds with any horse he rides. A small but genuinely useful shortcut for anyone hoping to build trust with a new mount more quickly than the game's default pace normally allows. Its location near a genuine shipwreck adds a small bit of atmosphere to what would otherwise be a fairly straightforward item pickup. The hawk that steadies the bow, tucked away in a lockbox near Deadboot Creek in the quiet wilderness of Amberino. The hawk talon trinket waits to be discovered by anyone willing to make the detour. Once claimed, it significantly reduces the stamina drain caused by drawing back a bow, a particularly valuable advantage given how early in the story players are first handed a bow and how often that weapon remains useful clear through to the game's final chapters. Its relatively remote location means plenty of players finish the entire game without ever realizing the trinket was sitting there the whole time. The trinket hidden behind a pacifist's patience. One of the stranger crafting requirements in the entire game belongs to the owl feather trinket, which demands that players complete a specific stranger mission called Archaeology for Beginners without killing a single living thing along the way. It is a surprisingly easy requirement to accidentally break, since the mission unfolds in territory where danger and distraction are never far away, making the reward feel genuinely earned for anyone patient and careful enough to see it through. Plenty of players reportedly fail the requirement on their first attempt without even realizing it, only discovering the rule after looking up why the reward never appeared. The reward buried at the end of a long hunt. The crowbeak trinket cannot be crafted through any fence at all, no matter how many materials a player happens to collect. Instead, it sits waiting at the very end of the Elemental Trail treasure map sequence, a chain of clues that only becomes accessible after reaching Chapter 6 of the main story. Once finally claimed, it permanently increases the amount of ammunition looted from fallen enemies by 10%. A quiet, practical reward for one of the longest treasure hunts the game has to offer. The sheer length of the clue chain leading to it has made the Elemental Trail something of a rite of passage among players who enjoy the game's treasure hunting side content. The edition exclusive advantage. 2 of the game's talismans were never meant to be earned through ordinary play at all. The Eagle Talon Talisman and the Iguana Scale Trinket were included automatically for anyone who purchased either the Special Edition or Ultimate Edition of the game at launch, granting an extended Eagle Eye duration and reduced horseback damage respectively, without requiring a single hunt, crafting trip, or hidden treasure map to claim either one. Players who bought the standard edition at launch and only later upgraded sometimes never realize these particular bonuses exist at all. The buck whose antler forgives mistakes. Hunters who don't always land a clean headshot, or who occasionally find themselves using the wrong weapon on the wrong animal, can quietly offset those mistakes with the buck antler trinket. Crafted from the antler of the legendary buck, it reduces the usual pelt quality penalty suffered from imperfect kills, letting even slightly clumsy hunters bring home consistently valuable pelts without needing to master every weapon-to-animal pairing the game expects of more dedicated players. It's a particularly forgiving early pickup for players still learning which ammunition pairs best with which creature. The boar whose talisman heals horses. Among the game's rarer crafting chains, the legendary boar talisman requires not just the legendary boar's tusk, but also a specific piece of cobalt petrified wood found inside a cart tucked beneath an overhang near Lake Isabella. Once finally assembled, the talisman permanently improves the overall health and hardiness of every horse Arthur rides for the rest of the story. A meaningful upgrade for players who spend the overwhelming majority of their time on horseback crossing vast stretches of frontier terrain. The unusual second ingredient makes this one of the more obscure talismans to track down without outside guidance. The hidden cost of every crafted perk. While most of the game's trinkets and talismans are technically free once their materials are gathered, players are often surprised to learn that nearly every fence still charges a small cash fee to actually complete the crafting process. Costs typically range from under $20 to as much as $40, depending on the specific item. Meaning even the most dedicated hunters and treasure seekers need to keep at least a little spending money in reserve before any of these permanent upgrades can finally be claimed. It's an easy detail to overlook for players who assume gathering the right materials is the only obstacle standing between them and the finished reward. The perks that never need equipping. Unlike many open-world games that require constant inventory management to keep beneficial items active, Red Dead Redemption 2 quietly simplifies things considerably. Once a trinket or talisman has been crafted, its passive bonus applies permanently and automatically, with no need to ever equip, manage, or even think about it again. Only talismans offer any reason to revisit the wardrobe afterward, and purely for cosmetic appearance, rather than any change in their underlying mechanical effect. That simplicity means a player could craft a dozen of these items across an entire playthrough, and never once think about them again afterward. The opossum's honest performance. Among the hundreds of animal species roaming the world of Red Dead Redemption 2, the opossum stands out for one small but remarkably accurate behavioral detail. While nearly every other creature flees the moment Arthur draws near, the opossum will instead drop to the ground and play dead, faithfully mimicking the exact defensive instinct its real-world counterpart relies on for survival. It's a tiny piece of zoological accuracy easily missed by anyone not paying close attention to the wildlife scattered throughout the frontier. Stumbling across it for the first time often catches players completely off guard, since nothing else in the game's wildlife roster behaves quite the same way. The newspaper that remembers everything, St. Denis Times, issues found scattered throughout the world, aren't simply decorative props meant to add period flavor. The paper's stories genuinely shift and update based on Arthur's own actions throughout the story, reporting on robberies, shootouts, and other notable events from the perspective of ordinary frontier citizens, watching the Van der Linde gang's chaos unfold from a distance. Reading through these dynamic articles offers a strange, almost voyeuristic glimpse of how Arthur's outlaw life is actually perceived by the wider, law-abiding world around him. Collecting and reading every issue across a single playthrough amounts to its own quiet side story, told entirely through someone else's eyes. The bandana's hidden mechanical benefit. For a piece of clothing that initially seems purely cosmetic, the bandana actually carries real mechanical weight once players understand how the game's wanted system functions. Wearing it over the lower half of Arthur's face while committing a crime genuinely shortens how long it takes for the surrounding wanted meter to clear afterward, since witnesses have a harder time identifying him afterward. It's a small detail that rewards players who experiment with disguise and concealment rather than relying purely on outrunning the law. Plenty of players reach the credits without ever realizing the accessory does anything beyond changing Arthur's appearance. The honor system's quiet reward. Reaching the elevated honor rank, known as Road Agent, unlocks a small but visually distinctive reward that many players never consciously notice they've earned. A dark horse bearing an unusual white face becomes available, bearing a striking resemblance to Baylock, the personal horse belonging to the story's primary antagonist. It's a subtle visual irony, rewarding players who have behaved honorably with a mount that visually echoes the one ridden by the man ultimately responsible for the gang's destruction. The resemblance feels deliberate enough that it's hard to imagine Rockstar's artist didn't intend the small, pointed joke buried inside it. The trapper who doubles your reward. Hunters who invest in the expert hunter outfit unlock a meaningful, often overlooked advantage when dealing specifically with legendary animals. Wearing it doubles the amount of loot gathered from skinning any legendary creature, with the sole exception of the animal's heart, which remains unaffected. Given how valuable legendary animal components already are for crafting talismans and trinkets, this single outfit quietly transforms an already profitable hunting career into something considerably more efficient. Most players only discover the outfit's true value after already completing several legendary hunts the slower, less efficient way. The 3-day wait for a second chance. Players who fail to successfully kill a legendary animal during their first encounter aren't simply out of luck forever. The game allows a second attempt, but only after 72 hours of in-game time have passed, typically achieved by sleeping through several full hibernation cycles at camp. It's a forgiving, if slow, safety net built into one of the game's more demanding optional systems, ensuring a single mistake doesn't permanently lock a player out of one of the 16 rare hunts. Plenty of players discover this system entirely by accident, having assumed a failed encounter meant the opportunity was simply gone for good. The gun that degrades with honest use. Unlike many open-world shooters, where weapons remain in pristine condition indefinitely, every firearm Arthur carries genuinely degrades with repeated use, requiring regular cleaning and maintenance to remain reliable. Neglecting this system results in jamming, reduced accuracy, and a noticeably less effective weapon in a firefight, a small but persistent reminder that survival on the frontier depends on more than just owning the right gun, but actually caring for it properly. It's a system easy to ignore for hours at a time, right up until a jammed weapon in the middle of a shootout makes the consequences impossible to overlook any longer. The camp that runs without permission. Long after Arthur leaves to pursue a mission elsewhere on the map, the gang's camp continues operating exactly as if he was still standing there watching. Members eat according to their own individual schedules, argue over old grievances, drink late into the night, and go about routines built entirely independent of player presence. It's one of the quieter technical achievements behind the entire game. A living, breathing community that exists whether or not anyone happens to be looking. Returning to camp after a long absence often reveals small shifts in mood and conversation that suggest life genuinely continued on without Arthur there to witness it. The 3 versions of every beast. Few players realize that each of the 16 legendary animals technically exists in 3 separate color variants within the game's files, generally split between dark, light, and patterned versions. Story mode players will only ever encounter one specific variant tied to the main game's narrative, while the remaining versions exist primarily for Red Dead Online, where additional animal sighting assignments and naturalist activities make the other coat patterns available to track down and document. It's a detail almost entirely invisible to single-player fans, existing mainly for the benefit of a completely different mode most story-focused players never bother to explore. The Reverend who remembers differently than most. Long after the gang's collapse, Swanson reportedly turns his life around entirely, leaving behind both his addiction and his complicated history with Dutch's outfit to pursue something resembling genuine redemption. His arc stands in quiet contrast to so many other fallen members of the gang, offering one of the rare storylines where a deeply flawed man genuinely seems to find peace, rather than simply meeting a violent or tragic end somewhere along the frontier. Given how visibly broken he appears throughout most of the main story, his eventual recovery stands as one of the more quietly hopeful threads in an otherwise heavy ending. The marriage that survived the chaos. Tilly Jackson, whose own childhood was marked by genuine horror at the hands of the Foreman brothers gang, ultimately finds something resembling a stable, happy ending by the time the epilogue concludes. She goes on to marry a successful lawyer, building an entirely new life far removed from the violence and uncertainty that defined nearly every year she spent riding alongside Dutch's gang. A small but meaningful note of hope buried within an otherwise tragic overall story. Considering everything she survived before ever joining the gang, this particular ending feels especially earned among the handful of genuinely happy outcomes the story allows. The builder of the final resting places. Charles Smith's quiet competence extends well beyond combat and survival skills. By the time the gang story reaches its devastating conclusion, it falls largely to Charles to handle the grim, necessary task of burying the fallen, including Arthur himself. That responsibility, carried out with the same calm dignity Charles shows throughout the entire story, cements his role as perhaps the single most honorable member of an otherwise deeply morally compromised family of outlaws. It's a fittingly quiet final duty for a character who spends the entire story doing the difficult, unglamorous work nobody else seems willing to handle. The vengeance that came full circle. John Marston's final act of loyalty toward the family he lost comes years after the gang's collapse, when he, alongside Sadie Adler and Charles Smith, finally tracks down Micah Bell in 1907. With unexpected assistance from Dutch himself, who by this point has come to recognize Micah's betrayal for what it always was. John finally kills the man responsible for so much of the gang's downfall, closing a loop of vengeance that had been quietly building since the earliest chapters of Arthur's own story years before. Dutch's small, almost reluctant act of help in that final confrontation is one of the only moments where he seems to genuinely reckon with everything his choices cost the people who once trusted him. The settling at Beecher's Hope. After years of running, fighting, and burying friends across the frontier, John Marston and Abigail finally find something resembling peace by 1907, settling down on farmland of their own at a place called Beecher's Hope. It is a hard-won, deliberately modest ending for two people who spent most of their lives defined entirely by an outlaw family that no longer exists, finally given the chance to build something quiet and permanently their own. The modesty of the setting feels deliberate, a far cry from the grand ambitions Dutch once promised everyone around that same campfire years earlier. The grief that outlasted the outlaws. Despite years of relative peace following John and Abigail's settlement at Beecher's Hope, their story does not end gently. John is eventually killed years later by US Army forces, and Abigail, left to grieve alone, dies in 1914 at only 37 years old. The game never explicitly states the cause, but based on what we know about her age and circumstances, this could imply either advancing illness or simply the slow, crushing weight of grief finally catching up to a woman who had already lost so much over the course of her difficult life. It's a quietly devastating coda that denies the story's surviving characters the clean, peaceful ending their years of hardship might otherwise have seemed to earn. The Cooper, who became a cautionary tale. Bill Williamson's entire arc traces a slow, steady decline from a dishonorably discharged soldier searching for purpose into one of the gang's most loyal, least self-aware members. After the gang's final collapse, Bill builds a small criminal outfit of his own, eventually fleeing toward Mexico in an attempt to escape the consequences of years spent following Dutch without ever truly questioning him. His eventual death at John's hands, carried out under direct government orders, closes one of the more tragic, quietly pathetic arcs among the gang's many fallen members. His unwavering devotion to Dutch, right up until the very end, makes him one of the clearest examples of just how dangerous that earlier cult-like loyalty within the gang could ultimately become. The 22 who defined a story. Across the entirety of Red Dead Redemption 2, the Van der Linde gang ultimately swells to include 22 distinct members, each one given enough individual backstory, motivation, and personality to feel like a genuinely necessary piece of the larger story rather than simple background decoration. Writers have confirmed that every single one of these characters was considered structurally essential, a deliberate choice that helps explain why so many players walk away from the game mourning fictional outlaws as though they were genuinely lost friends. Few open-world games manage to make an ensemble cast of this size feel quite so individually distinct and quite so collectively missed once the story finally ends. The letters that never stop arriving. Throughout the story, Arthur regularly receives mail delivered directly to camp, ranging from debt collection notices to personal letters from people whose lives he's touched along the way. This correspondence system means the consequences of Arthur's choices, who he's helped, who he's wronged, who he owes money to, continue to follow him no matter how far the gang travels across the map. It's a quiet bit of world building that reinforces just how small and interconnected this version of the frontier actually is, even as it dresses itself up as an endless open wilderness. Reading through Arthur's accumulated mail over a full playthrough quietly tells its own miniature story of consequence and reputation running parallel to the main plot. The distance between brothers. Although Arthur and John are frequently described as having grown up like brothers within the gang, their relationship throughout most of the main story is defined far more by tension than warmth. Arthur often resents being sent to clean up John's reckless mistakes, and John, in turn, struggles under the weight of expectations set by an older companion he never quite feels equal to. It is only in the story's final chapters, as Arthur's illness forces a kind of clarity neither man previously had time for, that the genuine depth of their bond finally surfaces in full. That delayed reconciliation makes their handful of genuinely warm scenes together land with considerably more weight than they otherwise might have. The camp's unspoken hierarchy. Despite presenting itself as something close to an equal found family, the Van der Linde gang can reasonably be read as operating under a clear, rarely discussed hierarchy that shapes nearly every interaction at camp. Dutch and Hosea sit at the top as founding leaders. Arthur occupies an unusual middle position as both enforcer and confidant, and based on how the story treats them, newer or younger members like Kieran and Lenny seem to find themselves doing the gang's least glamorous, most dangerous work. That quiet structure becomes increasingly visible and increasingly resented as the gang's fortunes continue to decline across the story. Watching that hierarchy strain under pressure is part of what makes the gang's eventual fracture feel less like a sudden betrayal and more like an inevitable structural collapse. The honor system's hidden influence on the ending. Few players fully appreciate just how dramatically Arthur's accumulated honor rank shapes the tone and details of the story's final chapters. High honor unlocks gentler, more reflective dialogue and a noticeably more peaceful final confrontation, while low honor pushes Arthur toward a far colder, more brutal conclusion to his own arc. Because this system tracks choices made across dozens of hours of gameplay, rather than any single decision, two players can experience meaningfully different versions of the exact same ending, without ever realizing how much their accumulated choices quietly shaped what they saw. That hidden divergence is part of why so many players insist their own ending felt uniquely earned, even when comparing notes with someone who finished the exact same game. The inventor and his creation. In St. Denis, a stranger mission chain introduces Marko Dragic, an eccentric European inventor clearly modelled on Nikola Tesla, who eventually reveals he believes he can create artificial intelligence. After helping him bring a small robotic companion to life in a sequence that plays almost like a tribute to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Arthur later returns to find Dragic's laboratory empty, except for his own dead body. Following an electric lantern left behind at the scene leads all the way to a remote mountain peak near Coulter, where the robot itself sits alone in the snow, quietly repeating the word Papa over and over to no one at all. The sheer distance between the lab and the mountain peak makes the discovery feel less like solving a puzzle and more like following the final lonely steps of a story nobody else ever gets to witness. The snake that shouldn't be there. Deep in Scarlet Meadows, hanging dead from the branches of a tree, players can stumble upon an enormous snake far larger than anything that should naturally exist on the American frontier. Some longtime fans believe its placement is a quiet nod to Car from the Jungle Book, while others connect it to local legends surrounding a real Ohio ghost town, once rumored to be terrorized by a giant serpent. Rockstar has never confirmed either explanation, leaving the snake's exact purpose as much of a mystery as how it ended up there in the first place. Whichever theory a player prefers, the sheer size of the thing alone is usually enough to make the discovery memorable on its own. The House of Painted Sins. West of Brandywine Drop sits a cluster of abandoned cabins marked with unsettling phrases painted across their walls, warning of sin and uncleanliness among whoever once lived there. Every resident appears to have died violently within the same narrow window of time, and the dead snake found nearby only adds to the sense that something deeply unnatural swept through this small community. The game never explains exactly what happened, leaving players to draw their own conclusions about plague, mass hysteria, or something considerably stranger. The complete absence of any clear answer is precisely what keeps the location lingering in players' minds long after they've ridden away from it. The hut at 2 a.m. North of Emerald Ranch, a small and decrepit shack hides evidence of what once may have been a fanatical, secretive gathering. A note found inside hints that something significant happens around 2 a.m, and returning to the shack at that exact hour reveals a mysterious green light glowing from within. No further explanation is offered, and the encounter ends as abruptly as it begins, leaving curious players with more questions than answers about whoever once used this place. The precision of the exact time required is part of what makes the encounter feel deliberate rather than accidental, as though the game wants players to feel like they're intruding on something private. The pentagram beneath the floor. Hidden in the woods, northwest of Van Horn Trading Post, sits a small, isolated hut concealing a glowing red pentagram beneath its floorboards, visible only in the dead hours between 4 and 5 in the morning. Camping nearby at the right hour may summon a frightened woman who speaks of a demon consuming villagers before fleeing in terror. Given how openly the encounter gestures toward ritual and sacrifice without ever explaining itself, It's reasonable to assume Rockstar intended this as one of the game's deliberately unresolved horror threads, rather than a puzzle with a clean solution. The narrow window of time required to witness it means plenty of players who know the location still never actually catch the encounter in action. The Shire in the wilderness, east of Donner Falls, tucked into a quiet stretch of forest, sits a small round-doored dwelling that bears an unmistakable resemblance to a hobbit hole straight out of Middle-earth. Players cannot enter the home or interact with it in any meaningful way, but its presence alone feels like a deliberate, affectionate nod to Tolkien's work. Tucked into a corner of the map, most players never think to explore on foot. Its isolation from any nearby town or questline makes it feel almost like a private joke, left for whoever happens to wander far enough off the beaten path to actually find it. The gunfighter's last lesson, completing the demanding gunslinger questline, which involves defeating 8 legendary gunslingers scattered across the frontier, eventually rewards Arthur with a unique weapon bearing a phrase etched directly into its metal. That phrase happens to be a direct reference to Rockstar's own earlier title, Bully, released years before Red Dead Redemption 2 ever existed, a small wink connecting 2 otherwise completely unrelated games within the studio's catalogue. It's a reward most players only fully appreciate if they happen to recognize the reference, otherwise reading simply as a stylish bit of flavor text etched into the weapon. The bird worth more than money. In the marshes of Bayou Enoir, a small, vividly colored bird known as the Carolina parakeet can occasionally be spotted among the reeds. Killing one drops Arthur's honor and triggers a quiet, somber message, noting that the species is endangered. Killing 25 of them in total actually completes the species' extinction within the world of the game. An unusually grim and quietly moralizing detail, tucked into what looks, at first glance, like an ordinary piece of wildlife. It's a small mechanical choice with surprisingly heavy thematic weight, quietly asking players to consider the cost of their own actions on a world that otherwise feels endlessly renewable. The voice from an unreachable cave. After studying more than 30 different animal species for the in-game compendium, an entirely new encounter quietly unlocks east of Fairvale Shanty in Grizzly's East. A sealed cave entrance, impossible to physically enter, will respond to anyone standing before it with a lonely, friendly voice, claiming to be too large to ever properly join human society. The implication, never fully confirmed, is unsettling enough on its own without further explanation. The vague, unresolved nature of the encounter leaves plenty of room for players to imagine exactly what might be sitting just out of sight behind that sealed entrance. The mass grave. No one talks about. South of Van Horn Trading Post, a forgotten mass grave sits marked by a single weathered tombstone, etched with worker numbers rather than names, and a string of death dates clustered suspiciously close together. The grave hints at some past industrial tragedy, likely tied to the mining operations that once defined this stretch of New Hanover, though the game offers nothing further to confirm exactly what happened to the people buried beneath it. The choice to identify the dead only by number rather than name adds a particularly bleak, dehumanizing edge to an already grim discovery. The hut that hides a predator. Tucked away in the wilderness sits a small, unassuming hunting hut that appears, from the outside, no different from dozens of others scattered across the map. Step inside, however, and a fully grown bear will maul Arthur almost instantly. An unexpected and genuinely startling jump scare hidden inside what looks like a perfectly safe place to take shelter from the weather. Word of the encounter has spread widely enough among the community that plenty of players approach every similar hut afterward, with at least a little extra caution. The frozen soldier of Mount Hagen. High on Mount Hagen in the West Grizzlies, a long dead settler remains frozen solid in the snow, still wearing a weathered military helmet from some earlier era. Arthur is free to take the helmet for himself and wear it as a piece of headgear, a small, slightly macabre souvenir scavenged from a man who clearly never made it down the mountain alive. The remote, punishing terrain surrounding the body makes the discovery feel like a genuine reward for braving one of the map's harsher corners. The moon that actually changes. Few players ever look up long enough to notice, but the night sky above Red Dead Redemption 2 quietly tracks a full and accurate lunar cycle, moving gradually from new moon to full moon and back again over the course of real, continuous in-game time. It's a detail with no mechanical impact whatsoever on gameplay, included purely because Rockstar's artists clearly felt the frontier deserved a sky as carefully considered as everything happening beneath it. Players who do happen to notice often describe a small, quiet satisfaction in realizing the game's attention to detail extends even to something most people would never think to check. The bodies that don't simply vanish. Unlike many open-world games where corpses politely disappear once the player rides far enough away, Red Dead Redemption 2 handles death with unusual persistence. Human bodies left in town are eventually collected by the law, while animal corpses left out in the wild slowly decompose over real time, stripping down to bare bones if left undisturbed long enough. It's a small but genuinely unsettling commitment to realism that most players only notice after stumbling across the same kill site days later, returning to an old hunting ground and finding nothing but bleached bones where a fresh carcass used to lie, is the kind of detail that quietly reinforces just how much time has actually passed. The conversation that remembers where it left off. During long rides across the map, gang members and companions often launch into lengthy, expository conversations meant to fill the silence of travel. If Arthur happens to crash into a tree, fall from his horse, or otherwise interrupt the moment, the dialogue doesn't simply restart from the beginning once he's back in the saddle. Instead, the character picks up exactly where they left off, often with a small added line like, "Well, as I was saying," ensuring no player ever misses a single piece of story due to bad luck or a poorly timed tumble. It's a small bit of writing craftsmanship that most players never consciously register, even though it's working quietly in the background almost every time they ride somewhere new. The prisoner who pays in information. Wandering escaped prisoners can occasionally be found shackled along roadsides, sometimes chained beside the body of a fellow convict who didn't survive the journey. Freeing one by shooting through his chains doesn't just earn gratitude. Several of these encounters reward Arthur with the exact location of a nearby homestead ripe for robbery, turning a small act of mercy into a surprisingly practical source of income for anyone willing to take the risk. It's one of the few moments in the game where an act of kindness comes with such a direct and immediately useful payoff attached to it. The catalogue that sells itself. The thick shopping catalogues found in general stores and gunsmiths throughout the game aren't simply functional menus listing prices and stock. Flip through their pages and you'll find genuine advertising copy written for individual items, describing craftsmanship and customer satisfaction in the breathless tone of an actual period catalogue. It's an entirely unnecessary level of detail that exists purely to make browsing for a new rifle or a fresh coat feel like an authentic piece of frontier commerce. Few players ever read this copy in full. Since it has zero effect on price or function, existing solely to deepen the illusion of a real functioning marketplace. The letter that never reaches, Bonnie. Near Van Horn Trading Post, Arthur can find a half-drowned man washed ashore, barely alive after some unspecified disaster at sea. Before losing consciousness again, he hands over a letter addressed to a woman named Bonnie, apologizing for his absence and outlining his plan to earn enough money to win her father's approval and finally marry her. The letter can never actually be delivered, since visiting the matching ranch elsewhere on the map reveals the family has already moved on, leaving this small, heartfelt gesture forever stranded between two people who never quite reconnect. It's a quietly melancholy little side story that resolves nothing, mirroring the larger sense of loss and missed chances running throughout the rest of the game. The alligator's convenient appetite. For players looking for a quick and thoroughly final way to dispose of an unwanted body, the swamps surrounding Saint-Denis and the deeper waters of Lemoyne offer a grim solution. Toss a corpse into water known to be home to alligators, including the legendary specimen itself, and the reptile will glide over and consume it entirely within moments, leaving no trace behind for any lawman to ever stumble across. It's a darkly practical bit of emergent gameplay that plenty of players discover entirely by accident, long before they ever think to look it up. The track's too new to be old. Railroads appear constantly throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, both as a backdrop to the story and as the target of more than one daring heist. Look closely at the rails themselves in certain newer stretches, however, and you'll notice they're suspiciously clean, freshly laid, and entirely free of the wear and rust that should naturally accumulate from years of train traffic. A small but historically accurate touch, reflecting just how recently the rail network was still expanding across this stretch of the frontier in 1899. It's the kind of environmental storytelling that rewards close attention without ever drawing a single line of dialogue to explain itself. The honor that rewrites the room. Beyond simply shaping the tone of the story's final chapters, Arthur's accumulated honor quietly rewrites dialogue in a wide range of cutscenes, scattered throughout the entire game, not just at the very end. Conversations with other gang members, lawmen, and strangers alike can shift in tone and content, depending on whether Arthur has spent the story behaving like a gentleman or a genuine threat. A level of reactive writing that few players ever fully appreciate unless they replay the game with a deliberately different moral approach. Comparing notes with someone who played the opposite moral path often reveals just how differently the exact same scene can actually unfold. The 40 minutes after the story ends, completing both halves of the game's epilogue, as John Marston unlocks one of the longest credit sequences in modern gaming, reportedly stretching past the 40-minute mark once every contributor has been properly acknowledged. Rather than simply scrolling past a static list, Rockstar fills much of that time with additional cutscenes and quiet character moments, treating the credits themselves as one final, unhurried chapter rather than a simple afterthought. Sitting through the entire sequence in one sitting has become something of a personal tradition for players who want to give the story the full, unhurried send-off it clearly intends to offer. The detectives who circle back. Eagle-eyed fans of the original Red Dead Redemption may recognize the two Pinkerton detectives who appear hunting the Van der Linde gang throughout much of Red Dead Redemption 2's story. These same two men eventually go on to track down, employ, and ultimately orchestrate the death of John Marston himself in the original game's own ending. Meaning, Red Dead Redemption 2 spends years quietly setting up the exact same agents responsible for closing out John's story in the game that started it all, recognizing them on a second playthrough adds a genuinely chilling new layer to scenes that originally felt like little more than background tension. The numbers behind A Living World. According to figures Rockstar has shared about the project, Red Dead Redemption 2's enormous scope required roughly 2,200 days of motion capture work alone, supporting somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 individual lines of recorded dialogue and 300,000 unique character animations. Those numbers help explain why the world feels as densely populated and reactive as it does, since nearly every interaction Arthur has was built from genuinely original performance and motion data, rather than recycled, generic animation. Figures of that scale help explain why so many players describe the world as feeling handcrafted down to its smallest, most easily overlooked corners. The gorilla in the box. Tucked away somewhere in the West Grizzlies sits one of the stranger anachronisms hidden anywhere in the game. A fully grown gorilla, sealed inside a wooden crate, in a region of the world where such an animal has absolutely no business existing in 1899. There's no quest tied to the discovery and no explanation offered for how it got there, leaving it as one of those purely absurdist touches Rockstar occasionally slips into an otherwise meticulously researched and historically grounded world. It's the kind of discovery that tends to get shared and reshared online precisely because it has no story justification whatsoever, existing purely for the sake of a strange laugh.